Ah, yes, is this not what everybody wanted to talk about today? 100%, this is the big story in Canada that's going on in the sporting world, right? Today we are heading over to Alberta and going over an article published on The Hockey Writers by Rupert McDonald from earlier last week. This is a pretty simple idea, but it's one that garnered a lot of negative discussion, and as a result, I'm kind of a magnet to these things. I love seeing the controversial internet opinions about certain hockey decisions that should be made. Rupert McDonald published this article. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to go ahead and read it yourself. The Calgary Flames should offer sheet the Edmonton Oilers, Dylan Holloway, or Philip Broberg. Okay, now that is a can of worms there that I think both teams' fan bases will get pretty pissed off about. And I always say this, it's a tale as old as time. But if you have a trade idea, you have a transaction idea, you have a real trade that goes down. If one team's fan base doesn't like it and the other team's fan base does, then okay, you might have yourselves a little bit of an offside trade. If you have both teams' fan bases that like the trade, then okay, it's a win for everybody. But if both teams' fan bases don't like it, whether it's a trade or a signing or an acquisition or whatever, if both teams' fan bases hate it, then it's probably fair too. So let's go out there and talk about this idea, because Rupert McDonald opens up the article by saying that the Flames and the Oilers are in about as polar opposites as two NHL franchises can be. The Flames are in the early stages of a retool, or what many believe is a full rebuild, while the Oilers are coming off a Game 7 loss in the Stanley Cup Finals. As is often the case between rebuilding teams and contenders, they are also in opposite situations cap-wise. The Flames have over $21 million in cap space, while the Oilers are $2.45 million over the max. They have to trade at least one roster player before 24-25 begins to be cap compliant, even though that isn't where their trouble ends. Now, I'm pretty sure this article was written out before the Ryan McLeod trade, and that freed up a few $1 million a year, so yeah, okay, McLeod was traded 4 days ago, which was the 5th, which was after this article's publication. Maybe that takes away the entire purpose of talking about this, but you know what, the article still exists. I want to go out there and dive into this anyway. We got nothing else to talk about. I'm not going to make soccer videos out there, unfortunately. The Oilers also have two pending key RFAs in Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg. Both were first-round picks who boast plenty of potential. Even when the Oilers find a way to move out salary, the best they can do is sign them to bridge deals. If another team were to sign one of them to a more lucrative offer sheet, the Oilers likely wouldn't be able to match it. This is the route the Flames should take. Either player would be a good option, though here is a look at what both of these guys provide. Now, before we dive into the article and what they say here, I wanted to talk about these guys individually, from my own words, because of course, I kind of know a little bit about this stuff as well. Dylan Holloway is the guy that stands out to me as an absolute force to be. 14th overall pick by the Oilers back in 2020, he has slowly been working his way up into superstardom, although it did take him a very long while to get to this point. Holloway is now 22 years old and a few years removed from his Wisconsin Badgers days where he was an over-point-per-game stud. He had spent the past few years bouncing up and down between the Oilers and the Condors, but this season with Edmonton he really took off, with 9 points in 38 games in the regular season and 7 points in 25 games in the Stanley Cup Playoffs. He also had that 3-point game, he had 2 goals and an assist in game number 4 against Florida, which really put him back on the map for Oilers fans to say, hey, this guy is legit, he is going to continue getting better, and if he could keep on showing up in big moments like this, then we're going to have a pretty good prospect turn forward on our hands here. Unfortunately, though, that was the only production Dylan Holloway had in the Stanley Cup playoffs after the Vancouver series. But other than that, he still did have some good games against Vancouver, and then he had the one Game 2 against LA where he had scored 2 goals. So he's looking pretty good. Middle 6 caliber guy with some skill, top 6 caliber option long term. There could be some sort of an option for an offer sheet here if you wanted to bet on that potential, and if you wanted to say, hey, we have open roster spots here. The Calgary Flames just traded away a whole bunch of their guys. Jonathan Huberdeau has entered the rumor mill. If he gets traded, then there's room for even more players to step in and fill that top 6 role. And then you go over onto the other name in Philip Broberg, a guy who also showcased very well in the 2024 Stanley Cup Finals. There were a few games where he was like the only guy to score a goal, which is kind of unfortunate when you consider where the Oilers were in their timeline here, but either way, Broberg had 3 points in 10 games played in the Stanley Cup playoffs, including playing all of the finals games where he had 2 points in the process. Broberg is a mobile left-handed defenseman who, if he pans out, could be an absolute stud as well, although we always kind of said that this was the problem with Philip Broberg, was that he had the tools, he had the skating, he had the skill to be able to create offense, but the brain and what he does when he doesn't have the puck, it's not the best. He needs a lot of refining when he doesn't have open lanes to the net. He's not the most creative player out there. Obviously, he's gotten better as his career has gone on, but that was always the biggest knock on Philip Broberg heading into that 2019 NHL Draft season. Now, of course, both of these guys wouldn't necessarily be too expensive if you were to offer sheet them, but there could be some potential options for the Flames if you wanted to say that's there. Calgary has been acquiring a bunch of younger defensemen, and Philip Broberg could be the best of them all. Meanwhile, if we go over to the article, it goes out there and says this: when it comes to Dylan Holloway, the Flames have several intriguing forward prospects in the ranks, but few of them are projected to be as good as Holloway in the years to come. Potential is never a sure thing, of course, but with all the cap space GM Craig Conroy has, taking a chance on a Calgary-born forward like Holloway is well worth any potential risk. Holloway is probably closer to being worth $2 million a year, but the Flames have enough cap space to easily up that number to 3. That would make it much more difficult for the Oilers to match, and if they couldn't, the Flames would only need to part ways with a 2025 second-round pick. Which honestly, when you think about it, this guy was playing with Draisaitl in the postseason, and he was looking pretty alright. If you're able to get that kind of a guy at 22 years old for only a second-round pick and $3 million on an offer sheet, I'd say that's a pretty good bet. Let's go out there and read what this article says about Philip Broberg. It goes out there and talks about his skating, his breakout ability, his offensive potential, and then it says at the end here, despite having some exciting young blue line prospects such as Hunter Brzustewicz, Zayne Parekh, Jeremy Poirier, and Artyom Grushnikov, Broberg is the closest at this time to being a sure thing in the NHL. There is no wrong option for the Flames in this scenario. If they'd prefer adding a body up front, Holloway is worth pursuing, though if it were to come down to simply wanting the player with more potential, it's hard to look past Philip Broberg. If the Flames are willing to sign Broberg to an offer sheet and get him on a deal roughly around $4 million a year, they would only be required to part ways with the 2025 second, similar to Holloway. That would be almost impossible for the Oilers to match, and would be grand larceny for Calgary. Now, of course, this is just one article. Let's go over onto the R-Flames subreddit to read what some of the fans on there have to say about this idea. Should the Flames offer sheet Broberg or Holloway? Hell no, the top comment said. If they accept, you end up with an Oiler on your team, and you have to give up draft picks. I mean, it's fun to think about trying to screw up their cap situation more, but it's not worth it in reality, in my honest opinion. We would be saving Dylan Holloway since he's local. Okay, there is that angle popping itself up again. There also was one more comment here from Chemical Signal, which I thought was pretty interesting. No, number one, I don't think Holloway is substantially better than the young players we're struggling to find ice time for, like Jakob Pelche and Matthew Coronado. Two, I don't think Broberg is a significantly better defenseman than the players we're trying out on defense. Kevin Ball, Daniil Miramanov, Bean, and Pashal. If we find ourselves in desperate need of bodies at the start of the season, comparable players are often waived by teams at the end of training camp. So I think when it comes to the Flames fans' perspective, a lot of them don't want to give up picks. A lot of them don't want that Oilers stank, that rubbed-off residue of a guy who was playing for the blue and orange previously. I mean, the 2010s were filled with a lot of guys that were shared between the Flames and the Oilers, so it is kind of weird to see that idea being brought up, from the James Nealses, to the Milan Lucic's, to the Mike Smiths, to even the Troy Stechers, I think. I mean, he was traded over to Calgary last year, right? And then Edmonton this year. So there's a lot of guys that have been turning over from both of these teams the past few years. It is kind of interesting. But either way, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about the Oilers and the Calgary Flames. Whether or not you could see some sort of an offer sheet go down for one Philip Broberg or Dylan Holloway. Is it worth it in your eyes for a Calgary Flames team to pursue one of these options? And do you think the price justifies any sort of a move like this? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.